Hey everybody. Instead of doing a boring PowerPoint, no, my PowerPoints are great, aren't they? Instead of doing a stupendous PowerPoint, I thought instead it might be fun to have kind of a Q&A for our content presentation this week. So I've asked Drew to listen to the podcast ahead of time and come up with some questions, which hopefully reflect the kind of questions that you all will have as well. And so we're not going to do this super long, but we're going to take 10 minutes or so and kind of dialogue a little bit about Thomas Aquinas, use that as a way of establishing who Thomas was and why he's so important and what he was trying to accomplish. Now, a lot of this assumes that you've listened to the podcast. So if you haven't, I would hit pause right now and go back and listen to it. It's good. It's a really good one. And it won't take you very long. And then you can come back and kind of see how we're going to use Aquinas. The other thing to remember about Aquinas, just going into it, is that he's one of the two Christian philosophers. So last week we did Augustine, who was the Platonist. So this week we're doing Aquinas, who is the Aristotelian. And you can remember that by keeping the two A's together. Well, no, they're both A's, aren't they? Aquinas, never mind, that didn't work at all. Okay, so without further ado, why don't we just jump into it? And so Drew, why don't you tell everybody where you are and how's the weather and what you're doing, and then we'll see what questions you have.
Yeah, so I'm back home in Indianapolis, Indiana. It's a beautiful day today. It's like 72 and sunny outside. So we are thriving here in the Hoosier State, but we're predicted bad weather by the end of the week. So, that's springtime in Indiana for you though. But now I'm just in quarantine like everyone else. And so I obviously had time to listen to the podcast. It's like I had anything better to do anyway. But one question I had from the podcast was, in the podcast, he said, the light of reason, and this is him kind of referencing Aquinas here, the light of reason is derived from God, but this is given to us automatically when we are created as humans, and for the most part, no other assistance is needed. And so it seemed interesting to me to think about that intellect itself is like active and already buried in us, and we almost have to clear the muck out of the way to access it. But it was interesting too, because like it also said, like only when we try to explore the supernatural, the Trinity and other things like it, must additional light be added. Mm-hmm. And to me, I mean, that was just oozing with Aristotelian thinking.
Yeah, that's a really good catch. So one of the things about Aquinas is that he was in debate with philosophers at his time. He lived in the Middle Ages, high Middle Ages. He was in debate with philosophers who were trying to hold on to this kind of Platonic view of Christianity that goes all the way back to Augustine. So we're, 1,000 years from Augustine, but that kind of Platonic approach had held firm for that entire time. And so it had been well developed, and they're really smart people who had worked on it. And Aquinas thought that was wrong. He had rediscovered Aristotle, and he thought that they were missing something important. And so that was a really good catch you made, because I think that gets right to the core of what Aquinas was about. So what part of that, you tell me, what part of that seems the most Aristotelian?
To me, it seems...
I didn't tell him I was going to ask that question either. He was supposed to ask me questions, but...
to me, the most like Aristotelian part of it is that it can illuminate, it said in the podcast that human intellect can illuminate the images it derives from the senses so as to understand them. And so the understanding of the natural world through sense and through the perception of the senses seems really Aristotelian.
Yeah, that's really good. That's exactly right. What makes Aquinas is that he thinks you can know things by investigating the natural world. He thinks your mind is capable of looking at the world around you, seeing truth in it, and processing what that truth is through investigation. In fact, we can even speculate what that investigation looks like without reading Aquinas, because it's simply following Aristotle. So the scientific method, logic, right, all the stuff we talked about with Aristotle's epistemology just moves right into Aquinas, but he wants Christians to do it because he's ultimately going to say that the truth we find in the world is God's truth, and it makes him really comfortable sending Christians out to investigate divine truth.
Yeah, and it was interesting too, because like Aquinas even referenced Romans 1:20, and he was basically saying like the philosopher can know God indirectly through just observing nature.
Yeah, well, in Romans 1:20, everyone should look that up because that's a key. That becomes a key verse here. And what it says is the invisible nature of God is made known through the things that He's made, and that right, it's a key point for Aquinas because it authorizes. It's kind of biblical authorization for us to find God embedded in the natural world. Now, I will say this may stick out to us because I think just in the kind of pendulum of Christians swinging between Plato and Aristotle, a lot of Protestant Christians really reject that, right? They've sort of swung to the Platonic side and become very suspicious of the natural world. If you've ever been, right, well, even the distinction we make between secular and Christian music or secular and Christian books, even the distinction between anything that's secular and anything that's Christian, kind of there's a suspicion, a really deep suspicion of the natural world embedded in that. I remember when I was a kid, somebody came to my church and we were supposed to bring an album to church, and they put them in a big barrel in the parking lot of the church to burn them, right? Because we were getting rid of all the secular stuff, and we were only supposed to buy Christian records, I guess. I don't know if we even said that. Which it's weird looking back on. It's really weird, but it's also a pretty Platonic way of thinking, right? Because the natural world is bad, and so anything that kind of arises out of the natural world is inherently bad. And part of what Aquinas wants is to flip us to the other side of that. The natural world is actually pretty good if you investigate it the right way.
Yeah. Another thing too that I thought was kind of interesting that Aquinas brought up was, in his 5 ways that often aren't used anymore, like we talked about. But number 4 of the 5 ways said that varying levels of human perfection dictates a perfect being must exist. And when I first read that, it seemed very Platonic to me. It don't seem like God was a form and we were imperfect copies of that form. And so I was like, wow, like this seems almost very Platonic for an Aristotelian thinker.
Yeah. Well, it isn't in this way. So let me say 2 things about the 5 ways. So if you listen to the podcast or do any reading about Aquinas, someone will talk about his 5 proofs for the existence of God. And what he's trying to do is use natural reasoning, use philosophy to establish that God exists. And so he makes arguments not from the Bible or from human experience or, enlightenment or the Holy Spirit or, whatever other means we might use to prove God exists. But he wants to go to the natural world and give a philosophical proof that God exists. The reason he's doing that is because his Platonic opponents have said you can't do that. And God isn't available in the natural world because the natural world's corrupt, and so God isn't available. And so it's kind of a proof of concept, right? That if he can show from natural reasoning, which he means philosophy, that God exists, then we can use the natural world for anything else to find truth. And so so you can look at them, and they're difficult, right? If you know Aristotle, they make some sense, but they're sort of difficult. The main point of all of them is that there is at the beginning of the chain of creation God, right? And it's not a personal God in the way that Jews and Christians understand it, but there is a creator that we can call God. So he'll make an argument from motion, right? Things move. It's one of the laws of scientific laws of nature. Well, what was the first mover? There's an argument from causation, and so he'll ask, well, who's the first cause? Well, there has to be, right? So it's just a logical inference. And so he's making that what you're describing is very similar, but it's not moving towards perfection in the Platonic way. It's moving towards perfection in an Aristotelian way, in that you are progressing towards the originator, which goes all the way back to the beginning of that sort of chain of causation. So the fact that we can move, it's really an argument of motion. The fact that we can move says that there is a God who exists. But it really tells us, and the point here is that it doesn't tell us that much about what it means to be human. It really is just going back and kind of in a weird philosophical way trying to prove that God exists from nature.
Yeah, and one of the other things that I know I was reading about Aquinas, like, kind of made me stop dead in my tracks, was his thoughts on laws. And because he basically develops this thought of 3 different laws, natural, positive, and eternal. And he says that like natural laws are the laws that are kind of guide us and they govern man's sense of right and wrong, whereas positive laws are the laws that we typically think of, like laws of government that are, are handed down on people. And he held or said that if these positive laws that come from government stem from the natural law that guides man's sense of right and wrong, then it's almost like by abiding the laws from the government, you can earn your way towards salvation. And when I read that, I was like, oh my gosh, like that seems completely wrong, because we can see time and time again throughout history and the modern world that the laws of government are not always
Yeah.
good laws, and laws that would stem from the sense of man's sense of right and wrong.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good catch. And it's a good catch on a couple levels. One is that it does sound strange to our ears, right? And again, we're sort of suspicious of, I think it's this kind of Protestant, maybe even American suspicion of the natural world. So we're suspicious of government, we're suspicious of law making, right? But that's a Platonic way of thinking, because we tend to think that they're corrupt. Aquinas tends to think that things that come out of the natural order reveal God in true ways, so that what we discover there is actually true. And so he sort of comes up with this idea that there's this overarching law that God gives, but that law can express itself in two ways. It can express itself in supernatural law, and so that'd be specific rules that are like given in the Bible or something like that, right? So we know to follow them because God told us specifically to do it. But he also thinks that there are laws that are embedded in, that come out of nature itself, right? We know that these should be laws because they reflect the order and harmony of the universe. So for example, you can tell me this, why do we not speed? Why is speeding a good law? Why are traffic laws such good laws?
I mean, at the end of the day, it helps create order. If everyone's going the same speed, roughly, then traffic should flow easier and better. And
Right.
also, it saves lives from reckless driving.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Right. What you're always trying to do is create as much structure and order as you can while allowing people to get from place to place. And so he would say that laws like that just arise out of nature. We're just reflecting the structure and order of the universe when we make those laws, which means that they're good. And in a way, they mean that they're divine, right? Those laws are actually divine because they reflect the order that God has built into nature. And so a lot of laws, I mean, almost every law on the books should follow that sort of natural law. Now, the way to use that, though, is not to say every law is inherently good because somebody made it, because the government made it. The way to use that is to say, here's a pretty good test, right? Does the law reflect the order and harmony of the universe? If so, then it's a good law. And what you said is right. If it's a good law, which means it can get me to God, right? If I follow good laws, then I'm participating in the divine nature. And so I'm progressing, right? I'm getting better.
Yeah.
Martin Luther King, well, one of the assignments for this week is to read King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And that he uses that argument explicitly, like he quotes Aquinas and says, this is a good way to recognize why laws that discriminate on the basis of race are unjust, because they don't reflect the order of the universe. Right? The order of the universe doesn't allow us to recognize the distinction between races. And so when we create that makes it an evil law. The other side would be, right, if you didn't discriminate, then that makes it a good law. Right. That was a really good question.
Yeah. But I think it's interesting when you're reading Aquinas, just trying to understand how he thinks we can know truth and everything.
Yeah. It really is his big contribution, right? What he got from Aristotle is this notion that truth is available to us, which we said a bunch now, but that's really the key takeaway. What do you think? Let's talk just for a minute. I mean, we'll kind of go back and forth here, but what do you think is the significance of that? Why is it so important that we, in Aquinas' mind, that we would move from this kind of Platonic view that creation is inherently corrupt and we don't have to pay attention to it, to a more Aristotelian view that we can use creation positively?
Yeah, and to me, it almost stems from the idea of if someone can understand, or at least views that nature is good, and there's truth inherent in nature as you watch systems take place and everything in nature, then you can use this almost philosophical line of thinking, this Aristotelian, in this case, line of thinking, to help them understand like your theology. And so it almost becomes a tool of evangelism in a sense, just in a sense of how it can help them understand your line of thinking, or it helps us better understand their line of thinking and where they might disagree with our theology.
Yeah, I like that. And you've sort of uncovered what we did at the very first day of class. We did that thing from Paul about using philosophy evangelically, and that the way I approach that is very Aristotelian in that regard, because Aquinas, right? It's very Thomistic, because what you're looking for are those points of contact between what you know to be true from theology and what you can discover that is also and equally true from nature. And so it does open up a whole range of possibilities for discussion and things like that.
Yeah.
Good. What would you think about, let me just turn this on you again. How does this change our understanding of human nature, do you think? And yeah, there's a follow-up question to that. What do you think about human nature?
I think what Aquinas is getting at some fundamental level is like, if we can understand that the natural world has good things to offer us, and that like we can observe truth in the natural world through the perception of our senses and everything, then that might change some of our habits, in the sense of like it might help us better practice, like spiritual disciplines, even in the sense of like, if we see a beautiful day, like if we're walking around Johnson's campus and it's springtime and the trees are blooming and the sun is shining and the weather's nice, we almost, that perception of our senses can like, wow, this is beautiful. And if it was created by God, then I need to like offer a prayer of thanks to God for that.
Yeah, that's really good. It allows you to say that. Like my grandfather, who lived on our campus for all the time I knew him, used to always talk about East Tennessee being God's country. And for him, it was kind of a spiritual experience to sort of walk outside and encounter the beauty which is embedded in creation. And that Aquinas allows us to do that. Plato doesn't, right? A Platonist can't do that, but Aquinas can really say there's great value here, and by participating in that, then it allows you to come closer to God, right? And so what you talked about is a pretty good example. I think it would even change the kind of spiritual disciplines you did.
Yeah.
Platonists would discipline themselves to kind of reject the world, to embrace solitude, and but an Aristotelian's disciplines would be more outward focused. Social justice would be an issue because you have care for creation as kind of built into part of that mindset.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, that's right. And that, again, that's probably the second big takeaway. The first big takeaway is he allows you to engage with the natural world. The second one is just to start to think about how that changes your approach to your faith. And one way to sort of go back and read Thomas now is to look at all the things he wants to say about, if we can engage in the natural world, then this really changes how we become Christians and the kind of habits we pursue and what we think virtue is, right? The mean between extremes and stuff like that.
Okay.
All follow from that. Okay, that's good. This went a little longer than I thought, but it was kind of fun. Anything else you want to follow up with?
No, I think that covers all my questions.
All right. So I'll say this to everybody. If you have any more questions from this, then go ahead and send me an email, and maybe we can do a follow-up and kind of talk them through. But hopefully this was enjoyable. I thought it was actually very helpful.
Yeah.
So thanks, Drew, and we'll see you all at some point.